VisualPolitik community, with the hangover from the United States elections, there is one piece of news that has been filed away in a bottom drawer, but is nevertheless big news. Vladimir Putin's Russia has lost an important battle. And no, this time we aren't talking about a military battle on the Ukrainian front, but about a political battle for power and control of Moldova. Okay, I know, this may seem like a small, impoverished and largely irrelevant country, and however, the second round of the Moldovan presidential elections on 3rd of November could have meant a major victory for Putin. Why? Well, because everything indicates that the Kremlin was behind the campaign of one of the favorite candidates. Let's just say that Russia's propaganda apparatus was working at full speed. And remember, Moldova, as I said, may be a small and poor country, but it is a country that happens to share a border with Ukraine. Specifically, it shares more than 1,200 kilometers of border with Zelensky's country, and look how close it is to Odessa. A Moldova dominated by Russia would pose a new threat for the future. If a ceasefire were to be reached, and in the future Russia were to increase its military deployment on Moldovan soil, then Ukraine would have to armor this entire border as well, and that could be very difficult. What's more, control of this small country would also guarantee the future of Transnistria, the self-proclaimed republic allied with Moscow. But not only that, Moldova is also next to Romania, the country where NATO is going to install the core of its air defense in Eastern Europe. And as if that were not enough, it's also a potential contender for joining the European Union, something that, by the way, was hanging by a thread. Everything depended on the Kremlin-friendly candidate not winning the elections, which, fortunately, is what happened. That he did not win.
Pro-Russian Alexander Stoyanoglu admits defeat to Sandu in Moldovan presidential election.
Maia Sandu, the current pro-European president, won the elections again with more than 55% of the votes against the pro-Moscow candidate. Now, to what extent has Moldova, and by extension all of Europe, dodged another bullet from Putin? Well, you see, Moldova is a former Soviet republic that maintains very strong ties with Russia in cultural, political, economic, and even linguistic matters. And that doesn't just disappear overnight. And that is what Moscow wanted to take advantage of to further extend its tentacles of power and influence. I've already told you, put permanent pressure on Ukraine, prevent Moldova from joining the European Union, guarantee the existence and future of Transnistria, and place its influence close to Romania, NATO's next aviation stronghold in Europe. Note this last point. Romania and Moldova are two countries that are very similar and very different at the same time. They share many things, such as language and religion, but in other ways they are extremely different. For example, Romania is in NATO and Moldova is not. And what does this mean? Well, Russia doesn't want history to repeat itself under any circumstances. Basically, after failing in Ukraine, Moldova is today the last Eastern European country in which Russia has a chance to gain presence. And that's why this country has been the victim of many hybrid warfare practices for many years. A term that I'm sure you've heard many times, but that can sometimes seem very ambiguous. Hybrid warfare involves many things: controlling the media to disperse propaganda, intervening in the electoral processes of other countries, using illegal immigrants to destabilize countries. All this sounds familiar, doesn't it? Well, in this case, Moldova's Achilles heel is elections. As we've already said, just a few days ago was the second round of the Moldovan presidential elections, and the country has narrowly avoided the candidate closest to Russia taking power. We're talking about Alexander Stoyanoglu, the candidate from the Party of Socialists, which has very strong ties with Russia and is supported by former Moldovan President Igor Dodon. Nevertheless, that guy isn't Putin's biggest ally in Moldova, nor is that political party the main Russian tool in this country. Do you know why? Well, because the party that actually operated under the direct orders of the Kremlin was outlawed last year. Even so, its leader, a Moldovan oligarch, still has a great deal of power and influence in Moldovan politics, despite the fact that he doesn't even live in the country anymore. And here is where we get to the crucial point of this whole story. In this video, we're going to see how Russian intelligence and propaganda services act in the shadows to take control of a country. Because what's happening in Moldova is not an exception. It's part of the modus operandi of the Russian intelligence services. And let's also see to what extent what is happening in Moldova affects the rest of Europe and the future of Ukraine. Pay close attention to what follows.
The Moldovan oligarch.
What we're about to see is the playbook that Russian intelligence follows in order to influence the politics of other countries. What we're about to see is nothing less than the Kremlin's instruction manual. Pay attention because you may recognize many of these behaviors in your own countries. Well, let's begin. VisualPolitik community. When one country wants to influence and interfere in another, a key figure always appears: the puppets and the paid collaborators. The curious thing is that, in the case of Russia, these puppets are usually multimillionaire, powerful people with good access to the media, and in general with structures of influence around them that are already well formed. We've seen this in many cases. In Georgia, for example, we have the richest man in the country, the former prime minister who controls the ruling Georgian Dream Party from the shadows, the oligarch Bidzina Ivanishvili. There are so many oligarchs in Ukraine who, for a long time, were at Putin's service that we even dedicated a whole video to them here on VisualPolitik. A video in which we told you how the invasion drove them away from the Kremlin. We'll leave a link to it in the description below. Now, what about Moldova? Well, in the case of Moldova, Putin's enforcement arm is this guy you see on the screen, Ilan Shor, a guy who, as we've told you, doesn't live in Moldova because he had to flee in 2019 after being convicted of fraud, money laundering, and generally stealing more than $1 billion from the banking system. Well, the typical movie villain. And let's see, I suppose that if I were to ask you where he lives, most of you have a pretty clear idea, right? Indeed, in Russia, more specifically in Moscow. Now, how on earth does the Ilan Shor machine operate, and how does Russia influence domestic politics through a component that's not even in Moldova? Well, you see, Shor controls a huge network of collaborators in Moldova. We're talking about a whole army of supporters and pawns at his service. How did he achieve this? Very easily, in the most common way for countries that are less developed and that have a lot of corruption, by means of the checkbook. 130,000 votes. That is the figure Moldovan authorities estimate were bought in these latest presidential elections. In fact, it is believed that Shor may have sent to the country, in September of 2024 alone, $15 million, both for the purchase of votes and to finance other destabilization activities. This is not the first time Shor has managed to buy tens of thousands of votes in Moldova. In the 2023 local elections, massive vote purchases worth about $55 million were indicated. Now, you may ask, a guy who lives in Russia, how does he send money and finance these networks in Moldova? Well, surprise, surprise, he does it mainly through a Russian non-profit, the NGO Eurasia.
Sanctioned by the United States last September, this NGO has been used by Shor to transfer money from Russia and other countries to Moldova. It's money intended to buy votes. In fact, during the spring of this year, the Moldovan authorities managed to arrest more than 100 Russian travelers carrying amounts of between 8,000 and 9,000 euros, money that authorities claim was part of Shor's massive vote-buying scheme.
On top of that, this NGO also transfers Moldovans to Russia to train them how to cause riots and disturbances. In other words, to act as mercenaries, if necessary. To give you an idea, it's known that in exchange for vandalizing government buildings, more than $5,000 is paid to each one. And if this already sounds crazy to you, wait, because there's even more. Apart from financing vandals, do you know who else has been paying left and right? That's right, ordinary Moldovans. Ordinary people that his men were picking up on the streets. Now, what for? Quite simply, to protest. Thus, authorities believe that people who signed up for campaigns against the Sandu government received about $29. And if they spent the night protesting, the amounts could reach up to $100. But of course, in a country where the average salary is barely $670 a month and the minimum wage is around $275, these payments are not too bad at all. Let's just say that in Moldova, hybrid warfare comes pretty cheap. This doesn't mean that all those demonstrating against Sandu are paid, but the scale of the protest against her government, which are relatively frequent, does appear to be inflated by Moscow.
Thousands from Russia-friendly party join anti-government protest in Moldova's capital. The demonstration is the latest in a series of anti-government protests held over the past 18 months, mostly by the Moscow-friendly Shor party, which was declared unconstitutional.
By the way, Shor also had his own party with his last name in the title, the Shor Party, a party that had representation in parliament until it was declared unconstitutional in June 2023. Through it, Shaw has been channeling social and political discontent over the consequences of President Sandu's pro-Ukrainian position in the war. Because of course, Russia did not stand idly by. First, it implemented a sharp increase in the price of gas sold to Moldova, and then, in October 2022, Moscow completely cut off supplies. A disaster in a country that was absolutely dependent on gas coming from Russia. To give you an idea of what this cut meant, we can tell you that it explains to a large extent why Moldovan inflation soared to the crazy figure of 35%, which of course creates the perfect breeding ground for the emergence of all kinds of populist movements, and if money is involved, even more so. Because, as you can see, we are, to a large extent, in a synchronized game. Shaw's party attacked the government stance of supporting Ukraine. Russia then cut off the supply, and then began a huge, well-funded campaign to denounce the consequences of the war. Because on top of all that, Russia and its puppets have not only bought votes and promoted protests to interfere in the elections. For a change, they've also used another of their most traditional and powerful hybrid weapons: disinformation. Where Moscow heads, there's propaganda. Ukraine, Georgia, the Baltics, none of them escapes, and Moldova is certainly no exception. Through social media networks and media outlets, people's thoughts, perceived reality, and, to some extent, even their will can be shaped. Well, in Moldova, social media has played a key role. On Telegram and TikTok, fake news about the Moldovan president have been a daily occurrence. That she's corrupt, that she has hidden wealth, that she intends to take the country to war with Russia. A whole repertoire of incessant accusations. And the messages that Russia distributes are not only directed at Sandu, they also bombard networks with messages such as that the West caused the war in Ukraine, or that the European Union will never accept Moldova. Messages that are also repeated ad nauseum on some television channels. Channels that, just take a guess with whom they have a close relationship. Exactly, with our good old friend oligarch Shaw. In fact, in 2023, the Security and Intelligence Service of Moldova shut down about 20 Russian websites, and at the end of 2022, Shaw himself suffered a severe blow.
Moldova suspends 6 TV channels over alleged misinformation.
But do you want a concrete example of how this type of campaign manages to distort reality? Well, look, more than half of Moldovans consider Russia to be an absolutely crucial economic partner for the country. That without Russia, the Moldovan economy would collapse. And this is despite the fact that less than 4% of its trade is actually with Moscow these days, compared to the 54% with the European Union, which also accounts for 87% of all foreign investments in the country. In other words, Russia's influence on Moldovan economy is actually very small, despite the fact that the collective imagination thinks otherwise. Moscow's campaigns have managed to portray Russia as a huge source of money and prosperity, which, as you can see, is not true. It's something similar to what is also happening in Serbia, which we also talked about in a past video here on VisualPolitik, and where Russia follows exactly these same patterns we're telling you about. However, disinformation has not only served to shape the vote in the Moldovan elections, but even to increase ethnic tensions. And no, this time we aren't referring to Transnistria, but to the autonomous region of Gagauzia. Okay, so for most of you, this may be the first time you've ever heard this name. And no wonder, because when we talk about tensions in Moldova, Transnistria always comes to mind. A region that has basically been independent for more than 30 years. However, the autonomous region of Gagauzia has also become a headache. You see, in the southern part of the country, there's a region with a population of mostly Turkish origin, which, as well as speaking the Gagauz language, also speak Russian. It is by far the most pro-Russian region of the country if we don't count Transnistria. And what can I say? It's hardly surprising. Do you know how many of the 120,000 inhabitants of Gagauzia are informed through Russian channels? Around 90%. In other words, almost all the inhabitants of this region are constantly bombarded with Russian propaganda that plays on the worst fears of this population: ethnic and linguistic cleansing. To give you an idea, most of the information they receive is based on warnings. Warnings that the Moldovan government is allegedly planning to eliminate the Russian language throughout the country. Something that, given the information we have today, is false. But of course, if we take into account that almost 70% of the entire Gagauz population is Russian-speaking, it's normal that alarms are triggered, especially when their media is constantly peppered with this news. So it isn't surprising that last year, the oligarch Shaw got his way.
A pro-Russian candidate from the party of fugitive oligarch Ilan Shor won the second round of the elections for governor of the Moldovan autonomous region of Gagauzia.
Yevgenia Gutsul won the elections with the full support of Shor's apparatus. Vote buying, disinformation campaigns, they literally went all out. Since then, a new problem has arisen in Gagauzia for the Sandu government. Gutsul is particularly close to Vladimir Putin himself. In fact, this very year, 2024, she has met with him twice, officially in Moscow. And not only that, the region's governor has also taken a strong pro-Russian stance. She has rejected integration with the West, supports favoring cooperation with Russia over the European Union, and has even threatened secession. If the country already had serious headaches with Transnistria, now Gagauzia has made them twice as painful. Of course, threats of secession are mere hot air. The governor knows that the region, the poorest in the country with a 40% poverty rate, is totally dependent on Moldova and the West. Call me crazy, but when 70% of the budget comes from Chisinau and over 42% of the region's exports go to the European Union, the last thing you want is to become independent. At least if you don't want to starve. But even so, the fact that Moldova has not one, but two regions that are close to Moscow is a problem, as you can probably imagine. They practically make integration into the European Union a mission impossible, and that in a way is a triumph for Moscow. But in the latest elections, Moscow wanted to go all out and take control of the whole country, and there they failed. Even so, hold on a minute, because Russia has lost a battle, but not the war. The presidency in Moldova is almost ceremonial. So do you know where the real game is played? In the parliamentary elections, which will take place before June 2025. If Sandu and her Action and Solidarity party fail to retain the absolute majority they garnered in 2021, their pro-European plans will most likely be in serious trouble. That's why analysts are already warning. In the coming months, we'll continue to see how Shor continues to play his game in Moldova, and how he will surely redouble his efforts together with the Kremlin. And I know what many of you are wondering. How does it really make sense that Moscow is so obsessed with Moldova? To what extent is this a problem for the rest of Europe? Well, pay close attention to what follows.
Moldova, Russia's key pawn.
At first glance, Moldova is a country that tends to go unnoticed by almost everyone. It has no great resources, no military or geostrategic advantages or anything of the sort. Or at least that's what's commonly believed. However, as we say, the devil is in the details, and this story is no different. It's true that Moldova's armed forces are derisory. Apart from being small, they are poorly equipped and wouldn't even be able to contain a Russian invasion for a few days. However, its geographic location is important, at least for the time being. As you can see, Moldova is the last frontier that Russia could conquer in order to extend its power as far west as possible, as close as possible to NATO, and particularly to Romania. A Romania that, by the way, is in the Kremlin's crosshair due to this news.
In Romania, NATO is building one of its largest air bases in Europe.
We've told you about it a short time ago here on VisualPolitik in a video that we'll also link for you in the description. Romania will have the largest NATO airbase in Europe, known as the MK base, which is much larger, for example, than the one NATO has in Ramstein, Germany. Now, think about that for a moment. Don't you think that Russia would be interested in being close to the future NATO macro base? Well, it would certainly be in their interest. In this way, they could better track their movements, and if necessary, they could counteract the influence that NATO could project on the western part of the Black Sea. And VisualPolitik community, here we have to make an important point. It's not a matter of thinking about the current situation, but in this case, Moscow could be thinking in the long term. On top of that, control of local politics could slow Moldova's progress towards the European Union. However, and as many of you may already be thinking, Moldova has another, much more important strategic interest for Russia: its border with Ukraine. You see, if Moldova were to fall definitively into the Russian sphere of influence, Ukraine would be surrounded on practically all fronts. To the northwest by Belarus, to the north and east by Russia itself, and to the southwest by Moldova. Well, it's precisely this scenario that could bring Ukraine into total check. Why? Well, some military voices are clear. Moldova could provide Russia with the necessary position to advance in this or a future war towards an absolutely crucial point: the port of Odessa. It's from this port that Ukraine exports almost all of its grain to the rest of the world. It's one of the country's main sources of income today. Well, with a pro-Russian government, Russia could increase its deployment of troops and equipment in the country in order to be prepared. Let me stress that in Moscow, they're already thinking long term, and this move could be very hard for Ukraine. One way or another, there would be no truce. The Russian shadow would always be over their heads. So, you see, Russia has lost a crucial battle in Moldova, the battle for the presidency. But now the really important battle begins, that of the parliament. If Russia succeeds with its hybrid warfare weapons, with its disinformation campaigns, ethnic fears, and everything we've already told you about, the Kremlin could put the brakes on Sandu's pro-European agenda. This is the very real risk right now, and it has to be taken very seriously. In any case, it won't be that long before we know what the outcome of all this will be. Now, until then, the questions are for you. Do you think Russia will eventually win the parliamentary elections in Moldova? Will we see an even more egregious hybrid warfare campaign in the coming months, even worse than the one they waged against the president? And if Moldova's path to the European Union is halted, what do you think the repercussions would be? Well, leave us your opinions here below in the comments and let's start a debate. And very important, if you liked this video, like it and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't done so yet, so you don't miss any news. As always, thank you very much for being there. All the best. See you next time.